Alright, if you've ever worked with CSS before, then you've probably seen or written something like this. So this is a CSS property with a whole bunch of vendor prefixes before it. So you would have to write different prefixes for different browsers in order to use these new kind of experimental CSS features. And right around when there were a whole bunch of new CSS features coming out, it was called CSS 3, that was the hype. You would see these all the time, but you don't really see these prefixes as much as you used to. Maybe you haven't seen these for a while and you're wondering, do we still need to put vendor prefixes in front of our CSS, or is that just something that we had to do before? And I'll spoil it for you right now. The answer is kinda. You do still need to use them in some cases. But before I get ahead of myself, let me just give you a quick little history lesson as to why we had the CSS prefixes in the first place. And that's just because whenever there's a new specification for a new CSS property, whenever that's being drafted, they have to go back and forth, and I'm talking about W3C, or the organization that standardizes all of this CSS and actually gets it implemented. So the organization that's in charge of drafting all of these new CSS properties, they will go back and forth and try to figure out the best way to implement things, and that can kind of take a while. So at some of these browser companies, like WebKit is the engine behind Chrome and Safari, obviously Mozilla is Firefox right here. So some of these companies will get tired of waiting around for a new specification to be finalized, and they'll just put these features inside the browser before they're actually finalized. But since they're actually not finalized yet, they don't want to just put in the normal CSS property because it could change later down the line. So maybe they could decide later on that actually we want the 4 seconds to be here at the end, or we want it to be in the front, and then all the people who have already implemented this in their website, all of their websites would break, because if you change it after everybody's already added this to their CSS, then you're just going to break a lot of websites. So they didn't want to do that. So if it's an experimental CSS property or something that hasn't been finalized, then they would just add this browser prefix. And so finally later on, when it does get finalized, then they'll just drop the browser prefix and just use the original property. Because at the height of all the browser prefixes, all of these different engines had a different way of doing this, and that's why they had all of these different CSS prefixes right here. One for Opera, one for Microsoft Edge and Internet Explorer, one for Firefox, Chrome, etc. But over time, the developers behind these engines started to see that this is not really working out that well. For one, this is just a big mess, and it's really annoying for developers. If you're writing CSS, you have to keep track of all these different prefixes and which properties you apply the prefixes to, and it can just get really confusing really fast. And so what a lot of these engines do these days is, instead of putting in prefixes for new experimental features, they'll just add it to, say, in Chrome's example, into the flags. So it's an optional configuration that you can enable if you want. So at least for Chromium-based browsers, it's going to be something like Chrome/flags right here. And this is going to be all the experimental features. So if, for example, I wanted to enable CSS container queries, well, I wouldn't prefix it. I would just turn this on, enable it if I want to. And that's how you can test out new experimental features. Because a lot of these were only intended to be experimental features, but developers wanted to use them right away before they were actually finalized. And that's how we got into this mess of all of these different prefixes. And so since prefixes aren't really used anymore, you might be under the assumption that you don't actually need to use them ever again. But there are still a lot of properties that do need to have a prefix before them. There are much less than they used to be, but they are still there. And let me just show you this article right here. So this is a really nice article by CSS Tricks that basically searched through Can I Use. This is a website where you can look up some feature and see the browser support for it. So let's look up this CSS transition property. And now we can see that it's very well supported. As you can see, we have all these green lights. And the last time that this property was prefixed was in all of these older versions of these browsers. So in 2014, 2013, 2012, that's when these stopped being prefixed. And as you can see, after that, there is no prefix needed for these. So if you look at these charts, you can pretty easily tell if you still actually need to put a prefix for this. As another example, you can look up a more experimental CSS feature, and you can see that for Safari, it is still required to use a prefix, the WebKit prefix. So for something like this, you would definitely want to still prefix it. But anyway, there's a useful list here in this article I showed you here. And this goes over all of the properties in 2013 that needed prefixing, and it's all of these here on the left. And in 2021, all the ones to the right are still needing to be prefixed. So as you can see, it's a much shorter list than it was in 2013, but there is still a list. You do need to still prefix these properties right here. And with that being said, this list even is a little bit old itself. So something like position sticky, if we look it up on Can I Use, the CSS property sticky, we can see that all modern browsers support this. And the last version of Safari that actually needed to prefix this was in 2019. So in most cases, you're probably fine using this without the browser prefix. But for a lot of other properties that you see here, it is still required to use a CSS prefix, or it's just going to break in a lot of browsers. That's just how it is. And so you have a couple of options here if you don't want to go through and manually add all the browser prefixes and remember which ones that you have to do it for. And the first option is just going to be to not really use any of these CSS options right here. So honestly, this is what I do most of the time, and it's just not use any of these. So a lot of these are very experimental, very new CSS properties that still have a long way to go before they're actually finalized. And to be honest, you're not really going to run into using these that often. Basically, the only place you will see a lot of these is maybe on some Twitter thread showing off some cool new CSS feature that seems useful, but in real world applications, you're very rarely going to use. So for a lot of these, I'm aware that they exist. For example, image set seems very useful, but I don't use it just because the browser support for it is very spotty right now. And even if you were to use the prefix for some of these, it's not going to work across a lot of different browsers just because it's still in a very experimental state. So for example, this image set property, even in Chrome, even with the prefix, it has very limited support. So a lot of options maybe that you can use in Firefox aren't going to work in Chrome. So whenever I look at this just looks like a website breakage waiting to happen. And so I'm just not going to use this. I'm going to leave this. Maybe in 3 years I'll come back and I'll recommend all of you people to use ImageSet because of the browser support. But at this point, it's just not there. I don't really see me ever using this in a production website, at least with browser support looking like this. But like I said, something like position sticky, you can look at, and the browser support is so well defined that you can just go ahead and use it in production websites, and I really doubt that you'll run into any issues there. So if you're really in doubt and you really want to use some new and experimental CSS property, I would use this Can I Use website. It's caniuse.com, very useful. And your second option, which is a little bit more work to set up, but once you set it up, it'll automate everything for you, and that's to use something like Auto Prefixer. So Auto Prefixer is a tool that will automatically go through your code and just put in these browser prefixes wherever it's actually needed. So as you can see in the example here, this placeholder property still needs to be browser prefixed in some cases, so it will just automatically go over your code and insert those for you. So you would just type it like a normal CSS property, and then this will automatically go through and add them where needed. And if you're using a build tool like Gulp or Webpack or anything like that, you can pretty easily configure it so it's automatically going through all the CSS that you put into your application. It'll just convert it automatically for you if you set it up like this. You can also use it as a command line tool. I'll just go over this real quick so you can just see an example. So I have this project right here that is just a single style sheet right here. And what I did is I installed a few NPM packages. So you're going to want to get Auto Prefixer and then Post CSS and then Post CSS-CLI. This is the command line tool. If you don't want to use that, you don't have to. I'm going to install them globally, but you can also install them as a dev dependency. And then we can just run post CSS -- use auto prefixer, and then -o is going to be the output, so style -prefix.css. The input is going to be style.css. Let's run this, give it a second, and we can now open up the style prefixed. And so from the original file, this is just the same example as they have on their GitHub page, but as you can see, it's just added these. So if you just have a small website and you don't want to have to worry about browser prefixing, you can just have some script automatically run this every time you build your website or something like that. Or of course, if you're using something like Webpack or Gulp, then you can configure it to run automatically there. But basically what I'm saying is if you do a little bit of configuration, you can have Auto Prefixer handle all of that for you and you never have to worry about it. But to be honest, if I'm just working on a small project or a small website that doesn't really need all the complexity, then I will just not use any browser prefixes and I'll just steer away from some of these CSS properties that are a little bit new or experimental like I showed you. And so that would be my recommendation to you. You don't really need to be on the bleeding edge of CSS. Only if you want to look cool on Twitter do you actually need to use these. These are very cool from a technical perspective, and I'll be happy when they actually get more widely used in the future, more widely supported. But until then, I'm just not going to use these and never worry about browser prefixing ever again.